My father stood up in the middle of the mediation session, pointed at me, and told the mediator I had been stealing from him for years. I was sitting 3 feet away. I did not move. I did not say a word. I just looked at the legal pad in front of me and waited for him to finish. He did not know that the woman sitting across that conference table had spent the last 4 years auditing estate fraud cases for a living. He was about to find out. Let me back up. My name is Adrian Kowalski. I'm 31 years old and I work as an estate compliance analyst for a regional trust company in Scottsdale, Arizona. My job is simple in theory and complicated in practice. I review financial records associated with estates, trusts, and conservatorships to make sure the money goes where the deceased actually intended it to go. I catch discrepancies. I trace transfers. I find the money that people try to hide before the ink on a death certificate is dry. I have been doing this for 4 years and I am good at it in the specific way that people become good at things they were accidentally trained for their whole lives. My grandfather, Hector Orozco, taught me that. He was a retired postal worker who had grown up poor in Tucson and never forgot what it felt like to have nothing. He kept a spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer where he wrote down every single purchase he made, going back to 1994. Groceries, gas copies, birthday cards, everything. When I was little, I thought it was strange. When I got older, I understood it was armor. He had been taken advantage of once, early in his life, and he made sure it would never happen again. He died 11 months ago. He was 83 years old and he went the way he had always said he wanted to, at home, in his own bed, with the window open and the desert air coming through. I was in the next room. I heard him stop breathing, and I sat with him for a long time before I called anyone. He left me his house in Tucson, his savings, and a handwritten letter that I have read so many times the fold lines are soft as cloth. He left my father nothing. That is where this story really begins. My father, his name is Chet, and I will call him that because I stopped calling him dad a long time ago, is 62 years old and has been financially reckless for most of his adult life. He and my mother divorced when I was 9. She moved us to Phoenix. He stayed in Tucson, remarried twice, opened a landscaping business that went under, and then spent the next decade doing odd jobs and borrowing money from people who eventually stopped picking up his calls. I saw him maybe 6 times between the ages of 12 and 25. He remembered my birthday about half those years. His current wife, I will call her Stephanie, is 10 years younger than him and was a waitress at a diner he used to go to in Marana. She is not a bad person, I think, but she is the kind of person who follows whoever is talking loudest in the room. And Chet has always been loud. When my grandfather's will was filed with the Pima County Probate Court, Chet was notified as a legal heir. He had been disinherited, which you can absolutely do in Arizona as long as the will is properly executed. My grandfather had done everything right. He had his will drafted by an attorney, witnessed by 2 people who were not beneficiaries, and updated it 3 years before he died, specifically to confirm that Chet was being excluded intentionally and not by oversight. 3 weeks after the filing, I received a letter from an attorney named Boyd Schaefer. He was representing Chet in a will contest. According to the letter, my father was claiming that my grandfather had suffered from significant cognitive decline in his final years, that I had isolated him from his family, and that I had used my professional position to manipulate an elderly man into leaving me his estate. I read the letter twice. Then I set it on my kitchen counter and made a cup of coffee and stood at the window looking out at my backyard for a long time. Then I called my best friend, Quincy, who is a nurse at Banner Health and has zero patience for nonsense. She said verbatim he is literally accusing the estate fraud investigator of committing estate fraud. She paused. Does he know what you do for a living? I told her I was pretty sure he did not. She told me to make him find out the hard way. That was the plan I went with. The attorney Boyd Schaefer had dug up was the kind who advertises on bus benches. He was not incompetent exactly, but he was working from a template. The petition he filed was generic, vulnerable adult, undue influence, history of estrangement suggesting manipulation. He attached a signed affidavit from Chet claiming that my grandfather had called him in the weeks before he died, confused and frightened, saying he did not understand where his money was going. That was a lie. My grandfather did not make a phone call in the last 8 weeks of his life. He was on hospice. His phone was on the nightstand, and I charged it every day, and not once did he ask me to dial anyone. But here is the thing about legal proceedings: a lie filed in a document still has to be answered. You still have to hire an attorney, appear in court, and spend money and time and energy proving that the lie is a lie. The process does not care about truth at the intake stage, it just moves. My attorney, a woman named Sondra Fitch who had been practicing probate litigation in Arizona for 22 years, was very calm when I explained the situation. She asked me 3 questions. Was the will properly executed? Yes. Was my grandfather competent when he signed it? Yes. And I had documentation. Did I have any financial interest I had failed to disclose? No. She said, good. She said, let them come. I did not tell her everything I had already found. Not yet. I wanted to find more first. I had been named as the personal representative of my grandfather's estate, which meant I had legal access to all of his financial records. I had already reviewed them once, doing what I do professionally, making sure everything was in order before filing. But I reviewed them again, this time looking for something specific. Chet's claim was that my grandfather had been confused about his finances. I wanted to know if that confusion had been helped along. I found the first thing in about 40 minutes. In the 40 months before my grandfather died, there were 9 cash withdrawals from his checking account that did not match any of his regular expenses. No pharmacy, no utilities, no grocery charges, just ATM withdrawals and one wire transfer, ranging from $800 to $3,000 or $100 each. Total across all 9 transactions, $19,600. My grandfather lived on Social Security and a small pension. He was careful with money the way only people who grew up without it can be. He tracked every purchase in that spiral notebook. I had the notebook. I went through every entry for those 14 months. He had recorded everything: his electric bill, his annual car insurance, the $14.99 he spent on a new garden hose. He had not recorded a single one of those 9 withdrawals. Either he had forgotten to write them down, which was possible but inconsistent with every other entry in 40 pages, or someone else had made them. I pulled the records more carefully. 6 of the 9 withdrawals occurred within 5 days of a documented visit from Chet. I knew about those visits because my grandfather had mentioned them to me, briefly and without much warmth. Chet had started showing up about a year before he died. My grandfather had told me he thought Chet wanted something, but had not asked for it directly yet. He said he was waiting to see how far it would go. He had known. He had watched it happening and documented it and never said a word to me directly because he did not want to upset me. He knew I would have stepped in immediately and he wanted to see what Chet would do. I drove to Tucson the following weekend and went through the house the way I go through records at work, methodically, room by room, drawer by drawer. I was not looking for anything in particular. I was looking for whatever was there. I found it in the file box he kept in the closet of his second bedroom, the one that had been my room when I stayed with him as a kid and still had the same blue curtains from when I was 12. The file box had folders for every year going back to 2009, utility bills, tax returns, medical records, all labeled in his handwriting. In the folder marked Curtin, behind his most recent utility statements, was a small spiral notebook I had never seen before, different from the kitchen one, smaller with a blue cover. He had been keeping a second record. I sat on the floor of that closet and read every page. The first entry was from 16 months before he died. It said that Chet had called for the first time in over 2 years, friendly and apologetic, saying he had been doing a lot of thinking and wanted to make things right. My grandfather wrote that he was skeptical but that he was old and tired and that he had tried to be a fair man his whole life and fairness required giving people the chance to change. The entries got harder to read from there. Chet visited in April. He said he was behind on his truck payment and needed to borrow $800. My grandfather gave it to him. Chet visited in June with Stephanie. They said they were having a hard year. He gave them $12. Chet visited in August and brought up something my grandfather had not expected. He said he had talked to a financial advisor who told him that elderly people often benefited from having a family member help manage their accounts, just to make sure bills got paid on time and nothing got missed. He said it casually, like he was doing my grandfather a favor. My grandfather wrote, I told him I had someone who did that for me already. He asked who. I said my granddaughter handles my affairs when I need help. He did not like that answer. The visits continued. The requests for money continued. And then, in October, 3 months before my grandfather died, something else happened. My grandfather had a bad week. His heart had been giving him trouble, and he was on new medication that made him foggy for about 10 days while his body adjusted. I had been there for part of that week, and he had seemed disoriented, sleeping more than usual, getting confused about what day it was. I had documented that with his hospice care team. It was a known, temporary side effect. During that week, Chet came to visit. He brought paperwork. My grandfather wrote about it 4 days later, when the fog had lifted. He said he had not fully understood what he was signing. He said Chet had told him it was a healthcare directive update, just routine paperwork that everyone should have. He said he had been tired and his glasses were bothering him, and he had trusted that his son would not lie to him about something like that. What he had actually signed was a durable financial power of attorney naming Chet as his agent. I put the notebook down for a moment. I looked at the blue curtains. I thought about my grandfather at 82 years old, sitting in his own living room, signing a document he could not clearly read, handed to him by his son. I picked the notebook back up. He had figured it out within a week. A neighbor who was a retired paralegal had come over for coffee, and my grandfather had mentioned the paperwork. She had asked to see a copy. She explained what it actually was. My grandfather had written, I felt like a fool. I did not want to tell Adrian. She would blame herself for not being there. And that is not something I am willing to put on her. So instead of telling me, he documented everything. Every visit, every dollar, every lie. He wrote down the neighbor's name and phone number in case anyone needed to verify what she had seen. He wrote down the dates of the withdrawals he had noticed. He wrote a description of the power of attorney document and where he had filed his copy. The last entry in the notebook was addressed to me. It said, You are the most competent person I have ever known, and I mean that as the highest compliment I can give. If you are reading this, then things went the way I thought they might. The documents are in the green folder in the lockbox under my bed. The combination is your birthday. I'm sorry I did not tell you sooner. I did not know how to say it without making you feel like you had failed me. You never failed me. Not once in your life. I sat on that floor for a long time. When I got up, I went to the lockbox. The combination was my birthday. Inside the green folder was a copy of the power of attorney document, a list of dates and amounts in my grandfather's handwriting that matched the withdrawals I had already found, and one more thing I had not expected. The power of attorney document had been notarized. The notary seal belonged to a woman named Rita Gallegos. I looked her up. Rita Gallegos had voluntarily surrendered her notary commission in February of the previous year after a complaint filed against her in Maricopa County. The document was dated 8 months after that. Someone had used an expired commission on a document signed by a confused 82-year-old man. That is not just fraud. That is a felony in Arizona, multiple felonies actually. I called Sondra the next morning and told her what I had found. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, This changes everything. She said she needed me to bring her everything: the notebook, the bank records, the power of attorney, the notary information. She said the will contest was now the smallest part of this problem. She also said something I had not expected. She asked whether my father knew what I did professionally. I told her I was almost certain he did not. She said good. She said she wanted to keep it that way a little longer. I understood what she was saying. I had spent 4 years sitting across conference tables from people who had helped themselves to money that was not theirs. I knew how they behaved when they thought they were winning. They got comfortable. They stopped being careful. They committed further to the story. I wanted Jack to be very committed to his story before I showed him what I had. The mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday in March at a suite of offices in downtown Phoenix that smelled like carpet cleaner and artificial lemon. Chet arrived with Boyd Schaefer and Stephanie, who sat in the back of the room and did not look at me. Chet was dressed in what I recognized as his version of professional dark slacks, a blue button-down boots that had been polished recently. He looked confident. He looked like a man who thought he was about to get what he wanted. The mediator was a retired judge named Arthur Pell. He was in his 70s, patient and methodical, the kind of man who had seen enough nonsense to recognize it without reacting to it. He introduced everyone, explained the process, and invited the petitioner to begin. Boyd laid out Chet's position. He talked about my grandfather's decline. He talked about my prefrontal background as evidence of my access and motive. He talked about the distance between my grandfather's home and mine, suggesting I could not have been providing genuine care. He used the phrase undue influence 11 times. I counted. Then Chet spoke. He talked for about 8 minutes. He said he had tried to stay close to his father. He said I had made that difficult. He said he had concerns for years about whether his father was being looked after properly. He said he loved his father. He was looking directly at Arthur Pell when he said that last part. And then he turned to me and he pointed. And he said that he believed I had been taking money from his father for years, that I had manipulated a vulnerable old man, and that he was prepared to prove it. I looked at the legal pad in front of me. Sondra stood up. She did not give a speech. She does not give speeches. She simply told Arthur Pell that we had evidence we would like to introduce, and she opened her folder. She started with the bank records. She walked through all 9 withdrawals, the amounts, the dates, and the documented visits that preceded each one. Boyd's expression did not change much at first. He was still waiting for the trap he could not see yet. Then Sondra introduced the power of attorney document. She pointed out the notary seal. She presented the Maricopa County record showing that Rita Gallegos had surrendered her commission 8 months before the document was dated. She pointed out that using an invalid notary commission on a legal document is a Class 6 felony in Arizona. She noted that my grandfather had been on documented hospice-adjacent care during the week the document was signed, and that his care team had recorded his cognitive state as temporarily impaired due to medication adjustment. She placed my grandfather's private notebook on the table. She read 4 entries aloud. She read them slowly, and she did not editorialize. The room was very quiet. Boyd asked for a recess. Arthur Pell granted it. I watched Chet during the break. He walked to the far corner of the room and spoke to Boyd in a low voice. I could not hear what was said, but I could see Chet's face as Boyd spoke. The confidence left it in pieces. First confusion, then something sharper. Then what I can only describe as the particular look of a man realizing the thing he thought was his has already been taken back. He looked at me then. Actually looked at me, not through me, not past me. And I felt something I had not expected to feel, not anger, not satisfaction, just a deep and settled calm. Like something had been returned to its correct position. When court resumed, Sondra informed Arthur Pell that we had also referred the matter to the Pima County Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges related to the fraudulent power of attorney and the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She noted that the Arizona Adult Protective Services Fraud Unit had been notified. Boyd withdrew the will contest petition on the spot. Arthur Pell did not dismiss the matter. He said, given the evidence presented, he was referring it for criminal review, and that the withdrawal of the civil petition did not preclude prosecution. He said the evidence would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities. It was over in one afternoon. The Pima County Attorney's Office moved more quickly than I expected. A detective named Ruiz, thorough and quiet and not at all what Chet had probably imagined when he thought about investigators, contacted me 2 weeks after the mediation. She had pulled Chet's financial records. She had found wire transfers from my grandfather's account to an account in Stephanie's name. She had found evidence that the $19,600 was not the full amount. Over the course of 14 months, closer to $28,000 had moved through various transactions. Some of it had paid for a used RV that was currently parked in Chet's driveway. Chet and Stephanie were both charged. The charges included financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraudulent use of a power of attorney, and theft. Stephanie's charges were reduced after she agreed to cooperate with the investigation. The RV was seized. Chet entered a guilty plea 4 months later and was sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation, full restitution of $28,000, and 200 hours of community service. He was not sentenced to prison, which I think is probably the outcome my grandfather would have preferred. He had never wanted to destroy Chet. He had wanted the truth on record. He had wanted me protected. Both of those things happened. I received a voicemail from Chet about 6 weeks after his sentencing. I listened to it once. He said he was sorry. He said he had made mistakes. He talked for 3 minutes and 40 seconds and did not once use the specific words, "I manipulated my father and stole his money," which is the sentence that would have told me the apology was real. I did not call him back. I saved the voicemail in case I ever needed it and moved on. My grandfather's estate settled in the fall. I kept the house in Tucson. I go there some weekends, usually alone, sometimes with Quincy, who makes coffee too strong and fills every silence with commentary and is exactly the right person to have around when you are sitting on the porch of a house that smells like someone you miss. I kept the notebooks, both of them, the kitchen one with 40 years of grocery receipts and the blue one from the closet. I am not sure why keeping them matters so much, except that they are his voice, his particular way of understanding the world, which was that if you wrote things down honestly, you could not be made a fool of later. He was right about that. He was right about that. He was right about most things. I went back to work the week after the mediation. My first case was a 77-year-old woman in Mesa whose nephew had been withdrawing cash from her account, using a debit card he had taken from her wallet without asking. We recovered most of the money. He avoided prosecution by agreeing to repay every cent and complete a financial literacy program, which felt insufficient to me but satisfied her. And she is the one who mattered. I have thought a lot about what Chet believed he was doing. I do not think he thought of himself as a predator. I think he thought of himself as a man who was owed something and was simply collecting it ahead of schedule. A lot of the people I investigate think that way. They have convinced themselves that the money would have been theirs eventually, that they are just moving up the timeline, that the person they took from would not have minded if they had understood the full picture. They are always wrong about that last part. My grandfather understood the full picture better than any of them. He understood it and he documented it, and he trusted me to do something with what he left behind. Not because he thought I would be angry, because he knew I would be precise. Paper trails do not lie. That is the thing about them. You can talk your way around almost anything, but numbers are numbers, dates are dates, and a signature on a document notarized by a woman who lost her commission 8 months before the ink was dry is exactly what it is, regardless of how you explain it. I learned that from a man who wrote down the price of a garden hose in a spiral notebook and kept it in a kitchen drawer for 30 years, just in case someone ever tried to tell him he had not earned what was his. There is an image I keep coming back to. My grandfather at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning, spiral notebook open, pen in hand, writing down the price of a bag of rice. Not because anyone asked him to, not because he thought it would ever matter, just because that was who he was. A man who believed that honesty on paper was a form of self-respect. He was right. And what happened with my father proved it in a way I could not have predicted. Chet thought he was taking advantage of an old man. What he did not understand was that the old man had spent 83 years building a character so precise and so careful that even his confusion was documented. Even in the weeks when his mind was foggy, even when he signed something he did not fully understand, he recovered and wrote it down. That is not luck. That is a lifetime of choosing to be the kind of person who tells the truth even when no one is watching. That kind of character has consequences. Good ones eventually, even when the road through them is hard. I think about that when I consider what I brought to that mediation room. People sometimes assume that winning in a situation like mine required something dramatic, a confrontation, an outburst, a moment where I exposed my father in front of everyone. But that is not what happened. What happened was quieter and more methodical. I had done the work. I had pulled the records, traced the withdrawals, found the forged notary seal, read every page of a notebook my grandfather had written for me without knowing if I would ever find it. I had prepared the way I prepare every case, carefully and completely, because I had been trained to understand that the truth does not announce itself. You have to go find it. That is the part no one talks about when they imagine justice. They imagine the moment it arrives. They do not imagine the weeks before it, the hours at the kitchen table with bank statements, the drive to Tucson alone, the afternoon on the floor of a closet reading your grandfather's handwriting by the light from a window with blue curtains you remember from childhood, the patience required, the willingness to sit with what you know and wait for the right moment to say it. Chet made his move because he believed I would not fight back. He had constructed a version of me in his head, someone peripheral, someone he could dismiss. He had not looked at who I actually was. He had not asked what I did every day, what I was trained to see, what I was capable of building from a set of bank records in a handwritten notebook. That is what cost him everything. I do not think of what happened as revenge. I think of it as a straightforward result. He made choices that left a trail. I followed the trail. The consequences came from the choices, not from me. I was just the person who knew how to read what was already there. My grandfather left me two notebooks and the house with blue curtains and a lockbox whose combination was my birthday. He left me everything he had earned, but the thing that mattered most was not in any of those. It was in the 30 years he spent being a man who wrote things down honestly, who kept his word, who lived in a way that made the record of his life clean and clear and impossible to distort. I am still learning how to do that. I am not sure you ever finish learning it. But I know what it looks like when it is done right, because I watched him do it for most of my life and I was paying attention.